Welcome back, everybody. This is Jonathan Rossi. I am the co-founder and the co-host here this evening, this morning at SIA's 10X Cybersecurity Awareness. I'm joined with my colleague and friend from Kenya, who's woken up early to be here with us. Thank you very much. William Makatiani. We're supposed to actually have two guests. Hopefully he can still join us. But sorry about that. I had to get the audio feed signal down on that side. So like as I was saying, this kicks off the first of 6 panels we have looking at Africa, really looking at the variety and the depth and differences in how cybersecurity is understood, how threats are contained, how education is developed, and really developing both the relationships across the continent and having more nuanced appreciation of how cybersecurity looks like. And with that, I wanted to turn this stage over to William. He can do a self-introduction, and we want to just have a conversation. He can talk a little bit about his research reports that he's been looking at, and we can kind of broaden that conversation in the continent and then look at some of the things that they've been studying the last couple of years. So with that, William, welcome, thank you, and good morning.
Good morning, Jonathan. Thank you very much. And I think it's evening for you, yeah?
It sure is. It's 8:30 in the evening, and for those listening in the East Coast of East Coast of the United States, it's 9, 10, 11:30. So thank you all.
11:30. Yeah. All right. So so it's morning here, and thank you very much for organizing a great event. As you did mention, it's early morning here. It's almost 6:30. Just high level, my name is William Makatiani, based in Nairobi. We run a cybersecurity company based here, but we do practice across Africa. Part of what we do is research, and we also provide services. I've been in the industry for almost, I would say, 13, 15 years. And part of what I've been involved in is audit, research, compliance work, some development work. So a little bit of everything. And it's been an interesting journey. I moved back to Africa in 2011, and since then, we've been really trying to build the ecosystem around cybersecurity. Part of that has been the Africa Cybersecurity Research Report, which we've been working on since 2012, and we publish this report every year. This year, there's a little bit of delay because of the COVID-19 issues, but we think we'll have the reports out in another 2 months. So by way of introduction, that's who I am, and I think I'll give it back to you just to get me started with. Yes.
Yeah, sure. So let's start with some big picture numbers. We have 525 million in the African continent that are connected digitally, which means about 40% of the continent is connected online. As we all know, as security professionals, that means the threat surface expands as digital transformation on one side of this means more people are connected. But the downside of this is you have more potential threat vectors, because as you get more people connected, you inevitably get, unfortunately, a more significant amount of threats that arise due to the vulnerabilities, and especially with newer people getting in online. So you talk a little bit about that in the context of this notion that I think for people outside of the continent, or at least I'm not familiar with what you call cybersecurity poverty line. Tell us a little bit about what that means and how that impacts cybersecurity education, cybersecurity protection.
So again, thank you for the question. I think when you start thinking about cybersecurity Africa, you have to go back to the story of how technology is consumed on the continent. And a big part of consumption on the continent is mobile. A big part of how people consume technology on the continent is really through their mobile devices. So you go into all these villages, you go into the urban cities, you get a lot of people watching videos online, using their mobile apps. And even to a certain point, if you're an insurance company in Africa and you're selling insurance and you're not on mobile, it's almost impossible for you to sell. And part of that journey now has forced people now to start looking at mobile applications. In countries, especially in the East African side of the country, you have mobile money is very big. And that, I think, has really helped with the uptake. Now, the one challenge you have with that, unlike in the Western world or even Asia, where most of the technology starts from work and then it goes home, most people will interact with technology on their phone first. And a bigger part of that, and another bigger problem with that is, unlike in most of these Western and Asian countries where people are educated, you know what you need to do in terms of a laptop, or how to use the laptop, you know how to use the internet. In most African countries, You go to the internet because you want to send a message, you want to communicate via WhatsApp, and that is your first interaction point. So the levels of awareness are not very high, and also it's become very, very challenging again to push people because of the languages. There are quite a lot of languages on the continent, which becomes another a major problem. Going to the issue of the cybersecurity poverty line. So 3 years ago, as we were reaching out to all these organizations in Kenya, Nigeria, Botswana, Lesotho, Uganda, it's quite a number of countries. As we started talking about what are they doing about cybersecurity, there was a very clear trend that we picked on. And that trend was really around, why do we need cybersecurity? And as we started asking questions, why do you need cybersecurity? The most answers we're getting really was, we have the technologies in place, but we cannot afford to buy a firewall. We can afford the antivirus, but we cannot afford to buy a firewall. And we now started asking questions. If you were to really go out and spend money on cybersecurity, how much do you think you can afford? And the focus here wasn't just on the big organizations, the big corporates. It was on the SMEs, what I would call the small, medium enterprises. And the goal of this was to make sure that we cover 80% of the market, and SMEs form 80% of the market. So as we started talking to them, we found out majority of these organizations cannot spend more than $1,000 a year on cybersecurity. And it's not a question that they don't want to spend or a question of even other issues, just a question, their priorities in terms of running the business don't allow them to be able to spend money. So that's where the issue of cybersecurity poverty line comes in. That is simply the amount of money these people are willing to spend, or the organization is willing to spend, and that is the minimum, or rather the maximum they can spend on cybersecurity. We found it a very interesting trend. Even in some organizations, it became very, very difficult in big organizations because the directors didn't understand. And when you ask them, would you rather earn a dividend or spend money on cybersecurity? They were still very keen on earning a dividend rather than spending money on cybersecurity. Yes. So that is the story around the cybersecurity poverty line. And you see it across. You'll find people going online, or even big organizations going and getting open source software. The problem with open source software, there's just so much you can do. It becomes more expensive in the long run. And sort of it forms a very good platform to you to try and understand the challenges on the continent.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a challenging issue. How do you overcome those issues, or at least approach that in a cost-effective way?
Okay, so there are a couple ways you can approach this particular problem. The first one is training and awareness. And the way you look at it is, a lot of these organizations don't know the dangers that they're facing, especially with cybersecurity. So education becomes a very critical component of the discussion. And I'll give you an example. There are some countries in Africa where you can't sell a service or a product, even a simple pen test, without educating them on why they need it or getting to a point where they appreciate what it is. And over the past 5 years, the ecosystem has changed. When I talk about the ecosystem, I'm talking about the regulations. I'm talking about the universities. I'm talking about the journalists. I'm talking about vendors. It's gotten to a point where every day we are now reading stories about an attack in the media. We're talking about a certain organization has been hacked. A certain minister's phone was compromised. A certain ministry's email was compromised. There was ransomware. And when people now start looking at that and contextualize that in their own sense of what will happen to the organization, it becomes a lot more easier for people to appreciate that. Another component is, unlike in most of these developed markets where you go in, you package a solution and you assume this is how everyone will buy a solution, you need to go back and now start looking at sectors, understand, and I'll talk about cooperatives, which is credit unions, which in Africa you call those SACCOs. In a typical SACCO, which is a small, medium enterprise, you really need to understand what their priorities are. If you come in and tell them, I'm selling you a very good device, but it's expensive and you need it to be paid within 1 year, it's too expensive. You have to figure out, how do you spread the cost over 2 to 3 years? How do you provide some local support? How do you engage so that they see value from this particular product you're selling them? So again, part of it is customizing the environment. Part of it is working with the different players, the universities, pushing content, working with the board of directors, and getting the media to appreciate what these people need to learn so that the journalists can report on some of the areas that are critical. And also you now package and provide long-term payment. It becomes like a loan, or lease this product to them and then pay over time. And that's one of the reasons why cloud solutions are doing very well in Africa, because you don't have a huge capex expense. People are willing to pay you, even if it's $1,000 a month over 3 years, then pay you $30,000. Then pay you $30,000 all at once.
How does education awareness look like? You mentioned there's a lot of cultural differences. Sectors are different. People's knowledge base is going to be different, widely different, especially when it comes to newer people who are going online. Company employees and users are going to be different from everyday users in the family. I imagine there's differences in language. If we're talking about the English-speaking part of the continent versus the French-speaking, education is going to look a lot different. Can you talk a little bit about how education looks like and how does that actually effectively be deployed?
So I think a bigger part of the education really happens in the corporate sector. So organizations that are formally set up and that have funding to do that. We also see some education from academia. So some universities will have programs that will guide on issues around cybersecurity. Lately, we've started seeing the banking sector, especially the financial services sector, because of the use of internet and mobile devices. They've also now started providing some level of education to their customers. So you'll get a bank or a telco sending out messages telling you, be careful about ransomware, be careful about phishing, be careful about responding to messages that you're not clear of. But in most of this, again, happens in the urban areas. What we found out is most of this messaging is effective if you can go out and get local people to deliver the message. So right now, a lot of the education is happening in the urban sectors. There is an effort by the telcos to go back and start helping some of the rural areas. And what we are seeing now is a lot of organizations are having sessions to talk about cybersecurity. Now, if you think about SACCOs represent, or cooperatives represent, a very good or rather huge population of Africa, and most of these are in the rural areas. Since they are very well placed in those rural areas, we're also seeing credit unions now going out and pushing the issue of education. But to be honest with you, if I was just to give a rough estimate, I would say 70 to 80% of the market, that is, or rather the technology using market in Africa is still not aware of the risks, and therein lies a big opportunity. The only challenge really is how do you build content that they can consistently consume and get them to appreciate. We've seen organizations build local content, some local, even in local, I would say, local comedians building content. Some of it ends up in being videos. But again, there is still a huge opportunity in terms of spreading. And the reality is most of these people are already using phones. So there is an opportunity, and it's a huge opportunity that is not being exploited. The challenge is how do you deliver without really affecting or without copying and pasting. So there's a challenge of understanding how do you build the content specifically for this particular audience.
Are there people doing this organically, locally?
So there are some organizations that are doing it, but one thing you need to appreciate is in most of these cases, you'll have some non-governmental agencies doing it. You'll have some organizations that have come up with a very good model. So they'll go work with some of these organizations, be it the credit unions, the banks, the local governments, and then they'll find ways of getting paid to provide this, because at the end of the day, there's the economic aspect of it, the financial aspect. So some very creative organizations have found ways of doing it, but it's a very low scale. It's a very low scale. No one has rolled out a platform that can do videos and be able to do sound content or even messaging at a wider scale. So some people are doing it, but it's a silo. It's just different areas on the continent.
Yeah. What about I want to go back to this thing that you brought up. 80% of businesses really look at the what did you call it, the upper limit of spending on cybersecurity related services or solutions? Did you call it the minimum spend? They going back to that conversation with the cybersecurity poverty line. 'Cause that's very fast. I'm going to tease that out a little bit more because that tells you a lot, because you're saying that's 80% of businesses in the continent, you would say, fall within this domain in your statistic from your reporting. Like, could you talk a little bit about that? Because that's very fascinating to look into that a little bit more and unpacking that.
Okay, so when you think about, and it's a very interesting conversation, I think, when you think about the relationship between a business and technology, and it's a discussion that fascinates me a lot, because when you think about most businesses and why they invest in technology, there needs to be some synergy that ties the business goal to the technology they're using. What we found out is in a lot of instances on the continent, there's a lot of vendor-driven decision making. So vendors will come in and tell you, organization A is just invested in this technology. You need to consider investing in the technology. It will make you work better. It will bring you value. But a lot of these business owners, in most cases, they're not very savvy, in the sense they're able to come up with a very clear strategy on where they're going from business and appreciate how technology is able to address or help them reach or meet the goals. Now, when you're already invested in something that you probably don't appreciate, and it's not that they don't appreciate because they don't want to, they don't appreciate because there isn't a lot of savviness, and technology is complex. When you now bring in a new complexity and start telling them now you need to invest in something called security, the first question they ask you is, when you came here, you told me this thing will work. Why didn't you think about this other component of security when you brought it to us? And I'll give you a very good example. There's an organization 2 years ago launched mobile banking. And when they launched mobile banking, they were very excited that they had launched mobile banking. 1 year into the launch, they had a very big cyber attack, and they will say they lost almost $100,000. And guess what the board did? They switched off mobile banking. They decided we are not going to do mobile banking again because we are losing money. And so when you think about that in the context of technology versus business, it had become easier. They had built efficiencies. They had built a lot of effectiveness. It was easier for them to be able to get customers to log on and do what they needed to do. But when you think about the management and the decision-making process, it became a lot more difficult for them to appreciate this thing because they didn't see the whole picture. And that is the challenge with 80%. Just because most of these organizations are not well-funded, sometimes it's a family that is bootstrapping and they've really pushed. They don't have the bandwidth to go back and say, you know what, we probably need to invest and plan ahead in ABCD. And that is where the 80% comes from. Majority of businesses on the continent are family-owned businesses. They are small in terms of scale. They do support the families that are sponsoring these businesses. And therefore, it's a very tight type of environment where the budget drives everything. And when I talk about budget, it's pretty much, if you're not making money today and tomorrow, it's a critical thing because the owner of the business needs to continue working on and building from that business. So that becomes a very key source, or rather key decision-making point, because if we are not making enough money to support why we're in business, then why should we invest in cybersecurity? But at the same time, they are dependent on the technology, which in the first place, the decision-making around why they invested in it was not very clear. So that gives you a sense of the 80% poverty line story. And in a sense, gives you a very good picture of where or how the African market makes decisions on cybersecurity. Not the entire continent, but I would say 80%, which is the small, medium.
Yeah, vendor-driven decision-making. I really like that. A lot of industry, as you've probably been in, William, a lot of the industry-focused conferences, is very vendor driven, right? Like who pays and access is based on who has access to tell that story. And so how much is that, I'm curious, percolates into the continent where it's not really driven by what are the actual needs on the ground. And instead, you can imagine this happens in places like Japan as well. It's the sexiness of all the technology and the machine learning and detection threat analysis and all these things that might have its place in different organizations. I can say that, but not necessarily are going to be useful in many contexts, in whether that's in the African continent or in Japan or Taiwan. I'm curious, what is the role of these industry-driven, vendor-driven, you mentioned it, role in creating that narrative in the continent? Because a lot of times we get this a lot, and this conversations about bridging between Asia and the continent is separating fact from fiction. These technologies might not necessarily work, or it might just be overkill. We don't really need all the bells and whistles. We don't want to spend $1 million, $2 million USD on a particular set of technologies and tools, and we really need to focus on basics, human-focused education, basic user control, how to properly get people to understand the vulnerabilities and simple things like patching and making sure that things are properly configured, as opposed to saying we need to sell them some sexy tool because we saw it at, Name Your Security conference out there. You go to them, and I think you were at RSA, right? And so was myself, and a lot of people probably listening, is how do you separate that and sort of make clear all the noise so that you can effectively advise businesses across the continent? I mean, that's a challenge that I'm always facing. I'm sure it looks like you're facing them too.
Mm-hmm. So for the longest time, I think the market was driven by what vendors were coming up with. And when vendors talk about machine learning, artificial intelligence, some manager or some decision maker will go for this conference and they'll come back, and you being the consultant, they'll start telling you, does your solution have AI? Does your solution have machine learning? Can you do analytics? And you sit back and you ask them, what is AI? And can you consume AI? You want a product that can be able to provide you with AI, but can you consume AI? So yes, for sure, for the longest time, vendors have driven decision-making in terms of who buys what and what they buy, and the sexiness of the product. You want to talk about product features and what they make and how. Now, for people who've tried to set up businesses in Africa, one of the most frustrating part of this whole journey is you get to a point where you realize people don't understand what you're talking about. And I'll give you a very good example. Someone goes to a conference, they're told we can be able to deploy data classification and data loss prevention. And for us to do that, we'll come in and understand the environment, we'll classify the data. Once we classify the data, we'll start looking at who's accessing GDPR data and all that. So the guys say, okay, let's do a POC. So these guys come in with all their devices and tools, and they say, oh, can you help us just confirm what type of data sets you have in place? It's like, hey, we're using an old system that was developed by one of our cousins here. I think you can meet them and decide how it works and figure it out. Now, you say the POC will take 40 days. I'm suggesting in the first 20 days, we want to see some value. So these guys, with all their big products, now start looking at this system. It was developed in COBOL or some language they don't understand. They start focusing on where to get the data. Nobody knows what data is critical. Nobody knows what data needs to be pushed in place. And then they hit a dead end. Before they even get any progress, the programmer is busy. The developer who developed the solution is not available. Meanwhile, they need to make a decision in 40 days. It is impossible, and which gets really, really frustrating. So we've now started seeing a trend where most organizations are now spending time to say, you know what, we might not be ready for AI, but what are the steps of getting to AI and how do we build that process? What that means is, from a typical product, you need to understand the people using the product more than the problem. If you don't build the product with the IT manager in mind, and you focus so much on the solution, or rather the problem you solved elsewhere, then you'll get stuck. You really need to spend time with the industry. And they're very good industry bodies now. If you think about the insurance industry, academia, manufacturing, they now have their own industries, and they're spending time understanding their needs. If you don't spend time with these people to build a solution that addresses what they know as a problem, it becomes very difficult. The days of coming in and say, oh, we've done this very well in the Middle East. We've solved it for Bank A, Bank C. We've done this very well in Spain. We've done this very well in Korea. And we're now here to help you. Those days are somewhat gone because the pain points are somewhat unique. The technology components, the frameworks might be the same, but the individual buying the solution will only get satisfied when they see the pain point moving away. And it's about people. It's about spending enough time with these people to understand how, why, and how they need to build it. So I see there's a big change in how things are working. And now, if you're a big player coming from some of the other markets, it's important for you to build local capacity around the consulting aspects, which means understanding the needs, delivering the needs, which then helps your solution fit the local aspects. And that is a huge, huge area that we are seeing growth across the region.
The people component, it goes back again to the people, human, listening. I spent my early career as an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley and looking at starting businesses, iterating, failing companies. And one of the things that we always came back to when we were founders trying to figure out what to do is listen to the customer. Go out there and talk and listen and sit there and just observe. People oftentimes, and I think you make it very clear, especially from the larger organizations, they're coming with their products and services, not understanding the local rules, nor the customs, and don't have the proper mechanisms in place to be able to have communication and a dialectic between the software development and deployment teams and then the people that are actually going to be the ones using them. So that's a very interesting point with that. Moving from there, what would you say then successful use cases of something like this being? You talked about mobile banking as very important and the interaction between human interaction between users and the internet has been through the mobile devices. How has that changed that conversation?
So when you think about the mobile banking / what I would say mobile money story, for the longest time, a lot of people in the urban areas just wanted to send money to their parents or relatives in the rural areas. And if you think about Africa, Africa is a very socially dependent society in the sense, if I'm making money for my cousins, I'm making money for my relatives. I support my relatives. You will not meet anyone who's grown up and been brought up in Africa, the typical African society, who will not give you 5 names of people they support. And it's a very big, I would say, economy. When you think about funerals, when you think about weddings, we support each other on a regular basis. Now, the one thing the financial services, the old traditional financial services never really understood very well is the social aspect of the financial services sector. And when I say that, I'm talking about there's a lot more money that moves around between people than in the traditional banking sector. And what Safaricom understood very well was, let's look at how people use money. Let's look at how the common citizen uses money. In a typical sense is, how are they spending? Even if it's $20, how are they spending that money? And then they started focusing on, we can help you send money to that individual without going to a bank. And of course, mobile technology did help with that. And we see that as a major driver of innovation. And I'll go back to the banking sector. Typically in the olden days, in the 90s, for you to do any banking, you had to show up. You have to sign up, fill maybe 7 forms, pay some money to keep the account running. But guess what? The guy who's sending money just earned $100, even that might be a lot, or just made $100. He wants to distribute a little bit to his cousin, to his relative, to all these people. But he doesn't want to go open a bank account. He just wants something he can trust. So when you think about how M-Pesa changed that process, it becomes easier for you to appreciate that. We are seeing also some new loan products that are targeting teachers, that are targeting government, that are targeting employees, and all these different players. And the beauty of it is they're looking at the local user. In African societies, you'll find all these people who work in markets. They don't need a lot of money. They need, in fact, sometimes they need $10 a day to go invest, buy something, and then go sell. They'll make their $20, return the $10 at the end of the day with some profit and move on. So that's your typical mindset. And when you build a product that fits these individuals, it's far much easier. Now, quite a number of governments have launched e-learning in a lot of schools across the region. So you'll find all these schools have very good bandwidth in terms of technology. You get very good high internet speeds, they have computers, they have labs, but unfortunately, they've not invested in getting the kids and the teachers to learn and understand the dangers. So you'll go in, yes, there's very good internet, but half the time they're accessing video, they don't know how to download, and the teacher who's supervising the student does not understand the aspects of what is it you need to secure. So what we are now seeing some organization doing is now going out and spending time training the teachers on the issues around cybersecurity and how they need to prepare the students. That is an aspect that, again, brings in the need. So the need might not be the corporate, but there is some funding that is available from these schools. The problem is you need volumes to be able to make your money back or get the awareness level that is required. So what I'm saying is there are cases where we've seen people go in. I've talked about M-Pesa, I've talked about the loan products. I've seen students or even teachers. We now have products that focuses on awareness. But when the teacher learns, when he goes back to the village, he's able to teach other people. We are seeing local governments now also going out and start investing some level of cybersecurity awareness. Hopefully I've answered your question.
Let's go into talking about some of the successes and what's going on the continent. We talk about some of the challenges with the cybersecurity poverty line. What about some instances of organizations, your organization, doing things which is advancing cybersecurity, whether it's at the educational level or in industry, and appreciating the differences in the requirements in successfully deploying and growing in different countries? Maybe take a look at that.
Okay. Yeah, so over the past couple of years, I think there's quite a lot of what I would call boutique consulting firms that have come up, and what they're really doing is they're going out and understanding problems in the different sectors. And part of the story here is these are people who understand technology in the sense they know what machine learning is, they know what log monitoring is, they know what encryption is, they know all these components, and they're going back and looking at each of these countries, be it Nigeria, be it South Africa, be it Kenya, be it Botswana, be it even all the Libya, Tunisia, and they're now spending time with the customers, understanding what needs to be done, and working with the different vendors to say, okay, maybe you don't need this feature. Can you build something that is unique in that sense? And I've done that myself. I've spent some time again in Silicon Valley with one of the vendors, and just sitting back and saying, you might not have enough time to invest in the market, but I know what these people need. So let's work on a solution that will allow us. And I'll give you an example. For many years, keyloggers were some of the biggest problems that the financial sector was facing. A lot of people going in, deploying keyloggers and stealing information. There are vendors who knew the problem but did not understand the actual aspects of what needed to be done. But working in collaboration, we've seen that reduced to almost, we used to have, I'll say, even 50 cases every month, different organizations. We've reduced that to maybe 2 or 3 cases every month. And that is a testament that, again, solutions do work. And this is something across the continent, just not unique to one vendor or one player. The other aspect we are now seeing also is governments are now investing in cybersecurity and using local firms and local consultants. As you might be aware, if government is not heavily invested in cybersecurity, it's almost impossible to get local organizations to build skills and capacity, because government spends a lot of money on cybersecurity. And when they pay you, it's a lot more easier to go out and do a lot of other things. So we are now seeing, again, in areas of education, things like what Cyberspeak does, what Cephas is doing on the continent, bringing together people from different countries and understanding this is what we're doing in Nigeria, this is what we're doing in Kenya. And to a certain extent now, we are seeing standards. So when you come to sell a product, you'll not jump on a flight into Kampala in Uganda and find a totally different mindset. You land in Senegal, you find a different mindset. They might speak different languages, but in terms of mindset, we are now seeing collaboration. We're now seeing conferences across Africa. You can go to Ghana for a conference and you'll meet people from Tunisia, you'll meet people from across the continent, and there is clear sense of what they need because the problems are very similar or somewhat the same. Their challenge has been they're dealing with so many different vendors, and we didn't have platforms to discuss those problems. So it makes it easier when I go out and I meet somebody from Botswana and I tell them, this is what we're doing in Kenya. And it becomes, they start appreciating. Then it becomes easier for you to move products or even solve problems into those markets. We've seen a lot of e-government initiatives across the continent. I'll be honest, I think probably 70% of governments have now gone online from typical government services to procurement services or even government planning. So it's a good initiative because with that then comes a need for security and also training and awareness, which then builds a market. Yes.
Yeah, indeed. This is a question that may lead into other panels that we have in the next couple of days is what's the investment climate look like in the continent for security, data classification, different systems that really are addressing needs that people across the countries and the various different regions have. Because it's one thing for having solutions that are built externally and then sold internally within the continent, but having something incubated, accelerated and developed locally, whether that's in Nairobi or in Accra, other places, maybe Uganda. What's that market look like? And is there a market for cybersecurity investments?
So there's a huge market. The problem is it's not, you won't jump in and understand and just, it's not your typical, I'm trying to find out the best way to explain this. So there is a market, but it's a very unique market in the sense you need to go out and get a market or a product or a solution that will get you volumes. You will not come in and sell quick sales and leave. And I'll give you a very good example. Over the past 1 or 2 years, we've gotten a lot of vendors who come in here and talk about MDR, manage, detect, and respond. Gartner is talking about MDR. Everyone is talking about MDR. Unfortunately, in Africa, when you talk about MDR, there is an R you're leaving on the table. When you talk about MDR, you're missing the remediation. As a consultant, as a service provider, I cannot just come detect and respond. I have to remediate because there are no skills. So a lot of people who come with MDR, they get stuck because all of a sudden the customer is asking, well, you found the problem, you responded, who is going to fix it? And they're willing to pay for that piece if you just explain to them how we'll address the challenge. So yes, there is a market, but you now need to understand how, what, where, how. And I'll give you some insights from even ourselves as Serianu. We do run a SOC. We do run a SOC in Nairobi. We run a 24/7 cyber command center in Nairobi. We are looking at building a second one in Botswana. Probably we had planned end of this year, but we'll move that now to mid next year.
So you'll be hiring.
By 2020. What do you say?
So you'll be hiring.
Yes. No, we've been hiring for a while. We've been hiring for a while, and that I don't think it will stop anytime soon. We are getting clients from Nigeria, from Ghana, from even Ethiopia, all these markets. And the difference is you need to come up with a different framework. You can look at ISO 27001, but then find ways of localizing it and building something that works. Make it easier, simpler, because your typical organization doesn't have huge teams to manage the framework. So yes, there's a market. There's a huge market in architecture, or let's say infrastructure security. There's a huge market. There's a huge market in areas of, and when I talk about infrastructure, I mean things like public infrastructure. A lot of these organizations never really had standards. So there's a huge standardization need there. There's a huge aspect of application security. Everyone is going online. There's a huge need there. There's a huge need in monitoring. There's a huge need in awareness. The challenge is the product needs to get the sense of what it is that the market needs and now be able to push it across. So in a typical sense, there isn't a market we go to as Serianu with what we do and not find customers. In fact, our biggest challenge is really not on the market. Our biggest challenge right now is to get enough people who can go and deal with those customers, because you need to be patient. You need people who understand the languages. You need people who can go in and address those particular needs. And I think the market is still growing, but there is a market. The question of presence of ability to pay and ability to go out and deliver and consume the services is not a question. It's just a question of how do you understand the market? How much time do you spend building a custom-made product for the market? Yeah.
I wanted to talk about something. I don't know if you can answer this or if you want to answer this, but it was just a thought that came to mind, because the two panels that we had prior to yours was two different members of the parliaments, one of Japan, the current sitting member of parliament in the Japanese House of Councillors, and then second, the Taiwanese congressman, who was a former congressman. And the discussion was, a discussion, a position that they held was that the world is moving towards decoupling with China. And I think it was Japan that recently had some legislation that was passed to help manufacturing to move away from reliance in China. I'm just curious, how does China factor into any of this across the continent? That might be a very loaded and quite complex question, so I'm sure it can lead to a whole conversation for weeks on end, but I was curious if that has any bearing into security posture. And because of just I imagine the degree of investments coming in from mainland China. I mean, again, this is not it's not a bashing conversation. It's really just to understand the roles of different countries and participation as we build and deploy systems that are secure and truly designed for the people. I'm just curious.
Okay. No, I mean, it's a good question. It's a valid question because there are facts on the ground. So I don't think it's bashing in any way. No, so the story of China and Africa is a very interesting story in the sense China has come into Africa and addressed areas that were not being addressed before. And I'll give you a very good example. If you think about your typical technology capabilities, and when I'm talking about servers, I'm talking about just the IT technology. China never really was able to play in that space in Africa. Now, when you think about telco, China is very strong in that aspect. So coming into these environments, there are some countries that have telecommunication companies, but they cannot fund those. So you see the Chinese coming in very, very strongly in some of these markets, and they run the entire telco. There are countries in Africa where if you go and talk to the telco company or some of the ISPs, you'll find out actually 80% of the engineering staff are Chinese. So from that perspective, we found cases where certain governments don't have control. And unfortunately in Africa, control means control, yes? Which means if I need to know who was talking to who, what, when, how, I need it now. I don't need that information to go back to China and come back to us. So we are seeing a certain shift, and I probably will not mention which countries and how, but we are seeing quite a number of countries are going back and saying, okay, guys, let's now slow down on all these technologies we're acquiring from China. Let's figure out what can we manage. So let's get some of our younger citizens to go to China, learn how this technology works. Let's mix, let's get some technologies from Europe, from Japan, from all these markets. So we have some level of controls. The past 5 years, I think most of them were developing, and it was interesting because all of a sudden you had a telco. Instead of depending on some foreign company, the Chinese companies will come in, they will fund it, they'll give you funding, it'll be easier. But over the past 1 to 1.5, I would say the past 24 months, when you walk into some of these ISPs or telcos, most of them will start telling you, hey, as we start working on this, we want to find how to empower locals. I want the locals to be the ones running this and this and this. And the difference between China and some of these other countries was when Chinese come in, they come with the engineers, they come in with the consultants, they come in with everything. Unlike other countries which empower the locals or different players to be able to play in the industry. And it's a lot more competitive. So yes, we are seeing a lot in terms of people saying we are not going to rely on one vendor, we're not going to rely on one country. Yes, they funded it, but we need to find ways of being able to now jump and get our local folks to get involved in the management of some of these telcos. Mm-hmm. And it's changing fast. I know of one particular country where they've set up an 18 to 24 months period where most of the engineering capacity has to be done by locals. So that just shows you a little bit of where we need to go and what's changing. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about, I read something about Mauritius and what they're doing over there in the island. Have you spent any time doing work out in Mauritius? Curious if
So I've been to Mauritius. I haven't been in, maybe I'll say 12, I haven't been in 12, maybe a year. But Mauritius is an interesting country in the sense, when you think about even data protection and what GDPR is doing, Mauritius was way ahead of a lot of countries. And I think part of it, when you think about Mauritius, it does a lot of financial investments for a lot of countries across Africa. So there are a lot of people who invest through Mauritius. They call it tax heaven. They call it a tax heaven. So yes, so I think Mauritius has done very well in building very good standards. If you go to the island, the use of technology, it somewhat reminds me of, it has the capability of becoming a Singapore. Mm-hmm. But that's a far-fetched comparison, but it has the capability of becoming a Singapore. The only challenge is they're far off mainland, which again becomes a challenge. But in terms of the organization, in terms of the capacity, they've done a lot. And I have interacted actually with the ICT Minister for Mauritius. They came to visit. We run a cyber immersion center in Nairobi, where we provide different a training center, a forensics lab, a war room, just to show people what you can do. And it was amazing. The ICT Minister for Mauritius came to visit us when he knew what we were doing. And that shows you the level of involvement that even ministers have. In a typical African country, when you talk about an ICT minister, you assume it's some crony, it's a political appointee whom I don't understand. But this gentleman came to us, sat down with us for almost an hour, listened, asked questions, and invited us back to Mauritius. So from that sense, from leadership, from just the innovation and ability to push, it's actually a lot more happening in Mauritius as a country. The challenge is they are far off from mainland Africa. Yeah. And sometimes you want to be able to close, yes. But yes, there's a lot happening on the island. Okay,
wonderful. Any other places that you want to spotlight on the continent that's not so far? Because it's what, how many hundreds of miles away? It's a far distance, right? It's more closer.
Yeah.
People
it's 3 hours away.
Yeah.
By flight. Mm-hmm. 3 hours by flight. So yes, you get there, but sometimes it's different. So Rwanda is doing well. Huh?
Yeah.
Rwanda is doing well in terms of the focus. We're seeing a lot of focus on building solutions that work. And that is the difference between going out and selling products and actually sitting back and saying, okay, 40% of our population does not have access to healthcare. How do we use drones to deliver medicine? How do we use telemedicine? How do we use secure services to enable somebody to move money from different aspects? So Rwanda is doing well. There's also Ghana. There's some activity going on again in Ghana. So there's quite a number of countries where things are happening, and it's a question of using those as a proof of concept for the other countries across the region so that we can see a lot more capabilities across. Yes.
Right. Yeah, wonderful. That's great. Wow. So I know you have another panel later this week. You're going to be joining us. So maybe give a little bit of a teaser on what you're going to be talking about on that panel as we wrap up this one and close the first day of the summit to an end.
All right. I know you probably want to go rest also. So yeah, so I think on the panel, we'll be discussing opportunities. So I'll deep dive into some of the areas that I've been talking about. And when we talk about investment, I'll give examples of where we see opportunities. We'll talk a little bit about the challenges you'll face. The way you look at business, you've been an entrepreneur, it is a risk. You don't sleep because you run a business. You don't sleep well. Eh? It's a challenge. There are a lot of things that come your way.
Oh, yeah.
Customer, it will be the revenue, the tax agencies. So I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of the challenges of starting a business, the challenges of hiring people on the continent, the challenges of closing deals, the challenges of really getting value from your investment. Because at the end of the day, it's not getting the money. It's a question of returning the expected, be it profits, be it value to the investors. So I'll talk a little bit about that in the next session.
Okay, well, wonderful. Well, thank you very much, William. I appreciate it getting up early for us. I know we started a little late. We were trying to technically figure out and get Cephas on the line. He didn't get to join us, but I'm sure he's out there listening. So him and I have been able to put this together, and I'm very grateful that you were able to join us today, and also excited that you'll be back again later this week. So William, thank you very much. Do you want to say maybe a few words, a little bit about something that you're working on, something you want to leave for the audience that's still here? I mean, there's actually quite a lot of people still here. So.
No, we're very passionate. We are really, really passionate about what's happening on the continent. I think we've spent a lot of time investing in that ecosystem, building an African cybersecurity ecosystem. And we've just launched a program for high school and college students. Part of it is we don't think the education around cybersecurity and IT risk is really addressing the needs of the continent. In the sense, there's all this content that they're spending a lot of time. Meanwhile, our problems are way lower than what they need to focus on. So we're building a curriculum. We are taking out a lot of this, and hopefully, for those people listening, they can join us in this. We'll be building, I said, our first session, our first seminars have started in Kenya. We're looking at moving those to Botswana and eventually Nigeria. We are doing a lot in other countries. So it's a challenge, but we are building a market, and we'll be very keen on seeing who's interested in working with us to continue building the African cybersecurity ecosystem in partnership with Cephas and other players on it. Because there is value. There's talent on the continent. All the people who run in our SOC, we've hired them out of college. The only difference is we've had to train them. So there is capacity, there is need, there is work. The challenge is we need a lot more people to get involved, so we build standards that everyone can follow. But you cannot build standards if you're just focused on one product or one region. You need everyone to get involved. French Africa, English-speaking Africa, and even Portuguese-speaking Africa. So we're looking for partners. We're looking for different people to work with. And we think we know where the challenges are. We might not be right on point on what it is, but we think with time, we'll have a very clear sense of what we need to do and how to do it. So we just need people to work with.